Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. Thank you in advance for taking your time and participate today. I am Alba, the Portfolio Manager for Risk and Management at PECB. I'm delighted to welcome you all in the topic of risk assessment techniques, a critical success factor. The webinar will discuss the most commonly utilized tools and the reasons why their success is limited. In addition, risk identification and assessment techniques as part of ISO 31011 will be analyzed. Now, I would like to introduce you today's speaker, Mr. Eddie de Vries, a PECB ISO 31000 certified risk manager and trainer with 20 years experience in quality management and more than 12 years experience in enterprise risk management. Please be informed that you can ask your questions at any time during the webinar by writing them in the chat box of your control panel. We will answer to them during the question and answer session. I will now turn the time to Mr. Eddie. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the session.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the session, and why I thought it's so important to talk about risk assessment techniques is because at so many companies I find organizations not utilizing the techniques or not even knowing about the techniques, and what they do is typically just revert to the one area which they feel most comfortable with, which is a workshop area, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So welcome everyone. I'm going to go straight into the presentation. So I'm going to talk about the most commonly utilized tools and why their success is limited, and then I'm going to go into the tools to be utilized for successful analysis, and I specifically referred to the ISO 31010 document, which hosts a number of tools that can be utilized throughout the life cycle of your risk assessment process, which is the identification, the assessment, and the monitoring after that. As you all know, if it is ISO 31000 or the COSO model, the bit that we're really interested or really struggle with as organizations is the bit that's marked in blue, which is the event identification and risk assessment within COSO, and then in ISO 31000, it is the risk assessment specifically relating to clause 5.4, which is the risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation part. Why this is so important to us is because we want to try and identify, as you by now know, the definition of a risk is the potential future event that could stop us from achieving objectives. So we want to utilize this definition to identify as accurately as possible and assess as accurately as possible risks that could be detrimental to either the objective of a process or a strategy or a project. Whichever way we go, it is critical for us to define these. Now, risk assessment attempts to answer the following fundamental questions. What can happen and why? And that's part of the risk identification process. What are the consequences, also known as the impact of the risk? What is the probability of the risk occurring in the future, or the likelihood of this risk? And are there any factors that might mitigate the consequence of the risk or that reduce the probability of the risk? So that's having a look at your current control environment and see if there's anything that can that manages the risk currently. Lastly, a question is then asked as well, how do I monitor this risk? So it's one thing identifying it. A second thing is assessing how good or bad this risk is. Thirdly, understanding the control environment with that. And then at the fourth point, like I said, is how do I monitor it? Now, risk assessments, in particular, those carrying out risk assessment should be clear about what they want to do. The first thing is the context and the objectives of the organization. So understanding the context of the organization and understanding where that organization is going. What are they trying to achieve? The extent and type of risks that are tolerable and how acceptable risks are to be treated, or unacceptable risks are to be treated. So for one is, I need to understand, in pursuit of my objectives or strategy, what type of risks am I prone to accept, or what level of risk am I prone to see as tolerable, also in short referred to as risk tolerance or risk appetite. Now, a second or a third thing that we need to be clear about is how risk assessment integrates into the organizational processes. Generally, what we do currently, I'm making this a general statement, there are definitely companies out there that's very good with this, but in general, it is seen as a periodic process. So review or update your risk register once a month. Now the reality is risk is ever changing and it's dynamic. It's not going to wait for you until the end of the month or end of the quarter or 6 months or end of the year to show itself that there's a different reality in your risk than what you have in your risk register. So firstly, we need to understand that risk assessment is a continuous process and not periodic. Methods and techniques to be used for risk assessment and their contribution to the risk management process. So if we want the organization to be part of this, we need to provide a toolbox to the organization that will enable them to perform tasks and perform risk assessments in a repeatable manner with results that we can trust. The next thing is the accountability, responsibility, and authority for performing risk assessments. So who's going to do it? What is their role to play in it? And who's got the authority to do it? Then the resources available to carry out the risk assessment. So it's not just physical resources, but also resources in terms of tools, resources in terms of information, as well as physical resources. And how the risk assessment will be reported and reviewed. Now reviewed is normally a periodic thing. However, and reporting is normally a periodic thing. However, like I said, the process of risk assessment is a continuous thing rather than a periodic view. So risk assessment is the overall process of risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And risks can be assessed at an organizational level, department level, projects, individual activities, or specific risks related to specific objectives. Risk assessment provides an understanding of risk, their causes, consequences, and their probabilities. Now why causes are important to risk analysis and risk assessments is because the causes are in all probability the things we can manage and not necessarily the risk as such as we identify. Now typically on causes we would identify controls or processes or put some mitigation in place to manage those. If we can manage the cause of a risk, in all probability or inherently we will be managing the risk. So risk assessment provides input to decisions. So whether an activity should be undertaken, can we pursue the strategy, can we carry on with the project, do we need to realign? So taking that into account, it's a very important exercise. How to maximize opportunities, so identify the upside of risks we identify or the downside should we not pursue risk. So whether risk needs to be treated as part of the risk assessment process as well, and choosing between options of different risk, prioritizing risk treatment options, and then the most appropriate selection of risk treatment strategies that will bring adverse risk to a tolerable level. So it's something that is acceptable, which we most probably going to define within our setting context. Now, as this is not a full ISO 31000 presentation or webinar, I'm only going to focus on the risk assessment part of things. Now the biggest mistake organizations make is to go and develop one method which is generally known as risk workshopping. Now the downside, although risk workshopping has a upside to it. It has some advantages. The downside to it depends on two things. One is how good and knowledgeable the facilitator is, and secondly, how good the participation of the group in the workshop is. Now, if one of those variables are not very good, your results are going to be questionable. And once again, I want to qualify the statement: in all organizations, it's not the truth, or it's not the case, but it is definitely, in a large number of organizations, the case where they only utilize risk workshopping as the only tool in risk identification or risk assessment and identification, which creates a problem. If we only 20% accurate with our risk identification and assessment in a risk workshop, it means we're missing 80% of the crutch, which is a bit of a problem. Now, if we go and have a look at the process according to ISO 31000, it actually has 3 steps in it within risk assessment. The first one being the risk identification, which is the process of finding, recognizing, and recording risks. And this really is to articulate the risk, understanding, not necessarily understanding it, but putting it forward, getting it onto a register of sort. The second part of the process is risk analysis, which is all to try and develop our understanding of the risk. Now, understanding, should the risk occur, what would the impact or consequence be of the risk, what is the likelihood of the risk occurring, or probability, taking into account previous occurrences, has it happened before or not, and if not, what's the chances of it happening. The third thing is then the risk evaluation, which is comparing estimated levels of risk with the risk criteria defined when the context was established. Now, during the context setting, we then define what should be acceptable to as a risk to us and what not, and we would compare it to that then. This is in order to determine the significance and level and the type of risk. So the risk identification process includes identifying the causes and sources of the risk, which in all probability the hazard in the context of physical harm. The events, the situations, circumstances which could lead to a material impact upon objectives and the nature of that impact. Now here we want to understand the potential future events that could possibly stop us from achieving our objectives or take us on a different course. Now, at this stage, it's all about possible events and not necessarily the severity of this event or the probability of this event. Now, risk identification methods can include evidence-based methods, so what has happened in the past. Examples of it is like checklists or review or historical data, like I mentioned before. It's a systematic team approach where a team of experts follow a systematic process to identify risk by means of a structured set of prompts or questions. It's inductive reasoning techniques such as HAZOP. Now, the process we need to go through before we even identify it is to understand the objectives. The objective in 2 ways: one of the organization, where the organization is going, and the objective of the risk assessment that we want to perform. As we understand that, we then define the causes of the risk and then define the events or situations or circumstances under which it will occur. Now risk analysis can be split into a number of different assessments, and the one that we always go and utilize as risk professionals in all probability is the qualitative assessment, and this is really to try and get it on a matrix of sort, a high, medium, low type of approach, and it's a combination of your consequence and probability. And in most cases, it is a product of the 2, consequence times the probability, and it gives us a rating. We normally put some colors to it as well, just to highlight the acceptability of the risk. Semi-quantitative is methods where we use numerical rating scales for consequences and probability and combine them to produce a level of risk using a formula. Here also control views can be taken into account where a control is effective or adequate or not effective or not adequate, and we can combine that to end up with a result. But the one that is really imperative to us is the one that's called the quantitative analysis. And the quantitative analysis is where we try and put some numerical value to it, and normally defined as a loss of money value. We want to try and understand, should a risk occur, what that occurrence would cost us. And if we understand that, we would have a much better idea in understanding how much money we can spend to manage the risk or fix the risk. So the probability, if we try and define the probability or do the analysis on the probability, there's three general approaches that's most commonly employed. The use of relevant historical data to identify the events, the probability forecast, which is also known as probability and non-probability, probabilistic models, and then the expert opinion can be utilized. And this is where an expert is brought in to either calculate on known data or on certain models to try and depict what's the probability of a risk occurring. At best, what we do at the moment is an estimation, and it's really the one, in a workshop scenario, the one that can debate the best, their probability rating wins. And in reality, we're leaving it over to chance and not to a calculated method, which creates a bit of a problem for us, because in the beginning, it was mentioned that risks are utilized to identify potential future events that could stop us from achieving our objectives. So it is imperative for us to be quite accurate on this, or as accurate as can be. And it's not about creating registers, but rather getting relevant information in. So the selection of a risk assessment technique starts off to try and identify the risk, which is step one. Our next step is a risk analysis to try and identify the consequence of risk. The next step, risk analysis, the probability of this risk occurring. And then the risk part of the risk analysis is the control assessment, where we have a look at the controls. And then lastly, to try and determine the level of risk, meaning try and put some logical rating to the risk so that we can identify if the risk is acceptable or not. Now, step one, risk identification. There's multiple tools that we can utilize to do risk identification. And some of these tools, I just highlighted a couple, but they are very well defined in ISO 31010. Some of the tools that we can utilize to do risk identification is brainstorming, structured or semi-structured interviews. Structured and semi-structured interviews goes a lot into the direction of workshopping. Now, however, although that is a tool to be utilized, it should not be the only tool in your arsenal for risk identification. The next one is the Delphi method. I highlighted that in bold because I particularly like the Delphi method. It's where you develop check sheets or opinions from experts. The opinions are shared, not necessarily mentioning which experts said what, and you end up with an opinion after a couple of reiterations. Now, there is a bit of a problem with the Delphi method. It's a bit of a time-consuming process. However, you're going to have a much better result than just doing an interview or a workshop scenario. We could utilize checklists, primary hazard analysis, hazard and operability studies, once again HACCP, environmental risk assessment, the SWIFT analysis, what-if analysis, scenario planning, failure mode and effect analysis, FMEAs, which is utilized widely, can also be utilized for risk identification, cause and effect analysis, human reliability analysis, reliability-centered maintenance, consequence probability matrix. All of these could be utilized for risk identification. Now, as I mentioned, one of the areas or one of the tools that's most commonly utilized for risk identification and risk assessment is the risk workshop. Is you typically could end up with a scenario as the picture on the screen, is where everybody agrees, however, everybody knows what the truth is. Once again, like I said, the success of your facilitated sessions can only be as good as two things. One, how good your facilitator is, and secondly, how good the participation is of the people within the workshop. So consequence and impact analysis is then the next stage, and why we want to try and understand the consequence is so that we can understand what the impact or the consequence would be of the risk should it occur. I already mentioned we can do that in three ways. We can do it qualitative, semi-quantitative, and quantitative then as well, which is the monetary value to it. There's a couple of tools that we can utilize for that, which is the HAZOP method, HACCP, the environmental risk assessment, structured what-if analysis as well, scenario analysis or business impact analysis, which goes a lot into a business continuity management. Root cause analysis, failure mode and effect, once again, I can use FMEAs for that, or event tree analysis. Some others that I want to mention as well is the F&N curves, the consequence and probability matrix, cause and effect analysis, and then multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDAs. Now, one that is hardly utilized is the cost-benefit analysis, where what am I to gain even if the risk occurs? And based on that, I can make a decision that I will not manage the risk, or I will accept the risk, or just reduce the consequence of the risk to an acceptable level. But it's all in pursuit of the value that I want to create in taking the risk. So the next step in the process is to do the risk analysis, specifically looking at the probability. Now, once again, there's multiple tools that could be utilized for it, and some tools are common to the identification, the consequence establishment, and the likelihood or probability establishment. There's some common tools in it. Now, one of those common tools are the failure mode and effect analysis, the root cause analysis as well, fault tree analysis, the bow tie analysis, consequence and probability matrix is the end result. It's, however, the probability axis is utilized on it. Our next step then is should we now understand the consequence, we understand the probability of it, is to go and define the control environment. Now controls are generally multiple controls are applied to a risk, and in most cases not a 1-to-1 ratio. So one control to one risk. It's normally multiple controls to one risk. And the reason being for this is we really excuse me, we really create controls to manage the causes or the contributing factors, also what it's called, to manage those, because if we can manage the causes of the risk, inherently we will manage the risk. So normally it's built up in a set or multiple controls onto a risk. Now the first step we have to have a look at is the adequacy of this control, of these controls to a risk. So we have a look at this basket of controls, and we have to end up with an opinion, and it could be through tests, it could be through expert opinion. Should these risks all be effective? Would they be adequate? Should these controls all be effective? Would they be adequate to manage my risk to an acceptable level? So it's generally referred to as evaluating the control environment adequacy. However, if we go a bit further, we can also go and have a look at the effectiveness of the control. Now, because we took all the controls and evaluated the adequacy of the basket of controls, we then want to try and establish if these controls are actually doing what they were intended to do. That's normally done on an individual basis. So each and every control. Now, if you're in internal audit, these controls would generally be tested. If you're in risk management, it'll generally be an opinion or based on a self-assessment basis where you can run then cast the opinion based on that. So we want to get all the controls and then cast the opinion on each control. Is the control effective, partially effective, or ineffective? Now, I know the auditing fraternity doesn't necessarily like the partially effective rating scale. They would rather say it's effective or ineffective or not effective based on the test that they're doing. However, partially effective for us is important because it means there's an area of improvement. We just need to re-implement or realign the process or whatever the scenario might be. But partially effective means it does part of it, but it doesn't necessarily satisfy the full design of that control. The next step is for us to go to the risk analysis and the level of the risk. And we then normally end up with some type of register, some type of color scheme within it, and I just included this as an example. We've got the risk rating, the inherent risk rating, which is the IR. We've got the residual risk rating, which is the after the control environment, and based on that, we would define if this risk is acceptable or not. Now, as I take this or as I go through this process, there's only really three things that's very important on this. The very first thing is that we need to create a toolbox for the organization to utilize and for the risk department to utilize to do risk assessments. The second thing is that toolbox should consist out of more than just doing a risk workshop. The third thing is to understand that our risk management process or our risk identification and assessment process is always looking at the control at the risk environment and the objectives that we want to achieve. So it is taken in context with our strategy or our objectives. It's not about getting the red risks to the green. It's rather, is the red risk in pursuit of our objectives, can I bear the red risk? This takes me to the next section, which is generally questions. Are there any questions?
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Very interesting and informative webinar. Personally, I really enjoyed it. We'll go with the first question, which is, how long should risk assessments be kept?
That is quite an interesting question. Risk assessment, depending on what you do a risk assessment on. If I perform a risk assessment on strategic level, I would most probably retain it for as long as the strategy is still relevant. But knowledge is power, and in saying that, if we understand what has happened in the past, we can predict and just listen to the word predict the future a bit better. So there's no real legal requirement to keep it. unless it is legislated within within the different countries or within either listing requirements or specific legislation. So to me, your guidepost would be for as long as the strategy is in play, that's how long we're going to keep the risk assessment results. However, if it's a health and safety issue, risk assessments are generally kept for a year because you have to do risk assessments on different processes and activities in South Africa at least once a year. Or if the activity changes, you have to do a risk assessment on the activity again. So it's generally guided by country legislation, company policy, and the strategy.
Thank you very much for the answer. We'll now move to another question. The concept of accepting a red risk is so hard to explain. How could I do this in a risk-adverse organization?
Okay, that's great. It's difficult for me to answer that question if I don't understand what type of industry you're in. Typically, if you're in a technology type of industry, it would be easier to explain it. But if you're in the financial or insurance type of industry, it's very difficult for an organization to understand that a red risk could be acceptable. So
excuse me for interrupting. The industry he's saying that is from the United Nations.
United Nations. Okay, so it's that makes it even more interesting. So it is always the guidepost that you should utilize is what's the strategy, and if I take the United Nations in general, what's the strategy of the United Nations and what's the objectives that we want to achieve? Now the United Nations has got an interesting role because they're there to protect and guide. So typically they would not necessarily want to accept red risks. However, in pursuit of your strategy and pursuit of your objective, it becomes easier to understand that you could accept red risks. But if you leave or disregard the strategy or your objective environment, it becomes very difficult to accept the red risk because there's no value at the end. There's no reward that is visible in taking a red risk.
Thank you very much for the answer again. Because of the time limitations, we will now answer to the last question, which is, I have no experience in risk assessment completion. Where do I start?
Alba, just repeat that again.
Yes, of course.
I have no experience.
I have no experience in risk assessment completion. Where do I start?
Yes. Okay, so it's in any risk assessment endeavor that you want to start, it's always best to start with understanding the objectives of the area or process that you want to assess. Now, if you don't have that, it becomes very difficult to identify things which we will call risks, but in short, things that could possibly stop us from getting to those objectives. So your starting point is to understand the area or project or organization or department objectives. That should be your starting point. Your next step becomes quite easy, and it's really questioning what potential future events could stop me from getting there. Those are the things we want to manage. Some organizations utilize a brainstorming method where all risks or any events would make it onto a register, and then they try and filter it to which ones has an effect to the objectives or which ones doesn't have an effect on an objective on objectives. Personally, and this is my personal opinion, it's not the best way to do. Although I think brainstorming is a very good method and very good tool to utilize. It should be brainstorming in a controlled method. So your starting point is always the objective or the strategy of that project or process or business area or organization.
Thank you, Eddie, again for the great presentation and for answering all the questions. It was great having you here today. Thanks to everyone who attended this webinar as well. We appreciate you being here. I want to inform you that this webinar is also recorded and can be found in our website and in our YouTube channel. We will also send you the link of the webinar in your email in the upcoming days. Please don't forget to check back on our upcoming webinars on topics of your interest because we will come next week again with a very interesting topic. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time, same day at the same time. Thank you, Eddie, again for the presentation.